Hi, whoever is out there. I'm Adrian Jackson from Cardboard Citizens, and welcome to, I think, the eighth in our series of Theatre of the Oppressed conversations. And it's been a fascinating series of conversations. The uniting factor of who I've had the pleasure of speaking to, they have all been people who have founded companies, working theatre companies around the world, who based at least a substantial part of their methodology on Augusto Boal's Theatre of the Oppressed. And those of you who've been avid viewers will know that last week I was speaking to Heng Leung and Ko Ling. Before that, I spoke to Luke Optipic of Format. I've spoken to Barbara Santosh, spoken to Mohamedou Dio, Sanjoy Ganguly, and we're working our way towards the end of this series of conversations. But I'm very happy to be speaking today to a very old friend, David Diamond of Theatre for Living, which he can tell you about himself. So welcome, David. David, are you there?
I'm here. Hi, Adrian. Hello, whoever's out there.
Hi, David. And particularly thank you for getting up incredibly early in the morning to speak to us. I hope it hasn't been too penitential to do.
I've been working myself earlier day by day for the last week, to be honest with you.
What time is it? What time is it?
Well, now it's 7, but in order to be here and alert for 7, I needed to get up at 5.
Anyway, thanks very much and welcome. So you kindly said you'd watched a few of these conversations, which is great. So you know the basic format, which is that the first half, I'm gently probing you to hear about your work and your career. And in the second half, I will be fielding at you questions which come in from the interweb. Just the warning is that because an hour passes incredibly quickly, actually, it's my experience, and because we're all great talkers and we're great storytellers, I think, in the Theatre of the Oppressed, I will take the liberty of interrupting, and this is my interruption signal, really not hopefully to be rude, but to get even more out of you. So that's my warning. So first of all, I've asked everybody really what you came from to the Theatre of the Oppressed, because we've had everything from fishermen to teachers to social workers. Where was your start, and how did you encounter TO first of all?
I was working as a professional actor in theater, film, television, radio, and then some friends and I started meeting in my living room once a month and complaining about the kind of work we were being asked to do. And we started a theater company that was at that point called Headlines Theater in 1981. And we did a number of productions. And then by 84, the collective had dissolved. I had become the artistic director, never having directed anything in my life, and had a question inside me. We'd been doing agitation propaganda theater, where we would decide the issue, we'd go and interview people living that issue, then we'd lock ourselves in a room, pretend we were them, and write a play for them, about them, at them, and you know, because we were young, perhaps, thought we knew everything, we'd also give them the answer. We understand your problem, and here's how you should solve it. And we were good at it. You know, the shows went well. But the question I had was, how do you do it with them? And by then I developed some friendships in the UK with John McGrath at 784 in Scotland, and Dave Johnston, who was at Theatre Centre. And I got them to invite me to come so I could raise some money, and off I went. And before I left, I wanted something to read. And so I went to the bookstore and picked up this book. I had no idea what it was. I just liked the title. And it was Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
You got the Frere first?
Yes.
Okay.
And so I'm traveling through Europe and I'm reading this book and it's blowing my mind because it's answering my question.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ended up at a theater, an education conference in Manchester, led by Chris Vine, who you know, I know. And he did this demo of this thing called Forum Theater by this guy, Boal. And I'm sitting there going, holy shit, that's what I'm reading about in this book. And Augusto had been arrested and tortured in Brazil for his work. He was now in Paris, and he was offering a skills sharing workshop. And the beauty of Europe, I went to Paris.
So that's so interesting because, of course, you're mirroring Augusto's own journey, much told, from making agitprop theatre into making a theatre that works with people. I just wanted to pick up on this actor discontent because it's actually something Katie Rubin and I chatted briefly about. What was your particular discontent at being an actor?
Well, you know, the actor's job, really, unless you're a megastar, is to sit by the phone and say yes to anything that comes along, just to work. And it's changed now in the community here, but at the time, there was no work that was connected to any kind of social issue. And I was already doing activist work, you know, before the theater company started. And so it was there was a need to kind of blend those things together.
So it was joining two sides of your desires, as it were, to still work in theatre, but to use your theatre gifts.
Having realized nobody was going to do that for us, we decided to stop complaining and make something.
I'm interested in the title because, first of all, you called your theatre company Headlines.
Yeah.
And then we'll come later to its later name. But why that title?
We didn't know we were starting a theater company. We were just doing this play on organizing for affordable housing. And we had to call it something. And we started the play off by running back and forth across the stage, yelling headlines out from the newspaper. This play got rewritten every day based on what was in the news. And so I wanted to call it Praxis Theater, but I lost that argument. And it got called Headlines Theater.
But it wasn't a newspaper theatre-based thing, what Boal would have called newspaper? No, it was just...
No, it wasn't. No, although, you know, it was agitprop, and it was modular so that we could rewrite it every day. It was angry, and it named names, and it demanded politicians' resignations, and there was music, and it was funny. You know, we had a scene in it between a landlord and a tenant in a wrestling ring. You know, there was dance in it. And it played in a different place every night. You had to really work to find it. And it was packed. We were totally unprepared for this.
So it took off. What year was that, David? What year was that?
1981.
1981. So it took off at a time, well, certainly in this country, and I guess in Canada, of great political ferment still going on. So perhaps there was a hunger for it. And take us through where it found itself most useful and most focused in all the possible areas of oppression. People don't necessarily know that much about Canada. I've only been there once, and the city I was in, your wonderful city, struck me as very affluent, actually, in a lot of parts, and the poverty quite well hidden, to be honest.
Well, you have to know, you know, we have an area here called the Downtown East Side that is ground zero for heroin.
Right.
You know, I run training workshops every summer, except for this summer, and people come to them from all over the world. And because of where the workshops are, people have to go through the Downtown East Side.
Right.
And they come in the first day and their eyes are like this. And they say, you know, I come from what gets called the third world. We have nothing like what I just walked through. So this is a city of huge extremes.
So was that then one of the areas of your focus, people?
At the beginning, no. I mean, over the years, I've done a lot of work in that area and on those issues. But when the theater company first started, well, you know, there was organizing for affordable housing, but it wasn't a play about homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And the next big project was on militarism.
Mm-hmm.
Was on how U.S. military policies affect Canadian foreign policy. You know, we live with this
How
huge.
would you decide? How would you decide, David, or who would decide what the next play was, what the subject matter was?
At that point, we would.
Okay.
You know, when we were doing agitprop work, we would,
Yeah.
the collective
Yeah.
would. You
But
know,
then,
based
then
on
as you morphed into headlines and became more at that point TO focused,
yeah.
tell us about the focus of your work, the constituencies you found yourself working with then.
Well, I came back from Paris with like all this stuff that, you know, had changed the way I thought about what was possible. It had answered the question I had, and I didn't know what to do with it. And so, because my brain works the way it does, I worked a 5-day journey out on paper that was 5 days, 8 hours a day, that might take a community from zero to performing forum and doing forum in a community. And because there was already a touring circuit, I got in touch with people who had hosted headlines tours, and I said, I have this thing, and I'm honestly, I don't know if this works or not. Like, I don't know if I can do this, but would you host a 5-day workshop in your community? And 7 communities around BC said yes. 4 of them, 3 or 4 of them were Indigenous communities. 2 of them were union based. 1 was a women's group, and off I went with somebody I met in Paris who you might know, Kevin Finnan from Motion House Dance in Leamington Spa. Kevin and I are very dear friends.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we met at that workshop with Augusto in Paris. And he came with me. I didn't want to go alone. And the first one was with the Stalo Nation, just up the valley here. And huge, profound things happened in that room about issues that the Stalo were dealing with as a result of colonization and residential schools. And it was extremely, and they loved it. It was extremely powerful. And then all these workshops happened that people were very generous. You know, they allowed me to learn what worked.
I mean, tell us a little bit about, I think a lot of people here, particularly in this time of Black Lives Matter, possibly don't know much about the status or levels of oppression endured by Indigenous peoples in Canada.
Yeah.
Give us a very quick thumbnail about that.
Look, all of us here in Canada, except for the Indigenous people, live on stolen land. Here in British Columbia, contact was, I don't know, 160 years ago. Nothing. 3 whole generations of Indigenous people were forced into residential schools as children. I mean, there's so much to say. If you didn't let your kid go to residential school, you went to jail.
When did that stop, David? If that stopped, I mean,
it stopped 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the last one.
Right.
In those residential, children at 6 years old were taken out of their homes, transported to remote locations, had their heads shaved, long hair had meaning, were put into uniforms, and brutalized by Christian churches. There was an agreement made between the Canadian government, and it started with the Catholic Church. It moved on to every other church. The legislation actually read to take the Indian out of the child. The abuse rates, the sexual abuse rates, were shockingly high. The starvation, unmarked graves, and so whole generations of nations went through this.
And again, that still continues in some level or other. I mean, what is the prominence or lack of it of Indigenous people? Again, it's Black Lives Matter question, really, in public life, in positions of power.
All of that. There are more children in care today than ever went to residential school. So the residential schools closed, but morphed into what gets called child and family services.
Mhm. Mhm.
You know, if you live in the north here in Canada, in an Indigenous community, you're drinking bottled water
Mhm.
because industry has destroyed your water table. You know, it's. I could just talk about this for the hour. It goes on and on and on.
So that became a very important part of your work as a theatre company, delivering these forum theatre residencies um, um, in two particular communities.
Yes, but it's interesting. I have to do a footnote because what really deepened it was a 3-year-long project with the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs up in northwestern BC that was not forum. It was presentational theatre that they invited me to do about why they were taking the Queen of England to court. That was the Delgamuukw court case, at that time, the biggest land claim in Canadian history. And that play was created up in Kispiox on reserve, opened there, toured BC, toured ocean to ocean across Canada, and toured into Maori communities in New Zealand, always traveling with a representative of the chiefs.
So like us, you do plays which aren't TO based necessarily, as well as TO. I'm interested to know a question which comes up here a lot about multiplication, about representation. Were you able, in some of your longer term relations with these Indigenous communities, to train up jokers from those communities?
I would sometimes go into communities to do training workshops, or people would, because I've been running training workshops here for this summer was going to be the 22nd annual. Of course, it can't happen. And Indigenous folks have come into those trainings, or I've gone into communities to do specifically to do trainings. And people have, you know, what happens is people take bits and pieces of the work. You know, you don't create a joker in a week-long training workshop.
Oh, absolutely not.
People take. But I also, years ago, started to try to develop a team of jokers around the company. And one of those women, Jackie, was Coast Salish, and she worked with the company for years and then became the executive director of a healing center, an Indigenous healing center on way up north on Vancouver Island, and used the theater work in the healing center. And Saide, not Indigenous, but Saide is originally from Pakistan. We met because she was in a piece that we did called Sanctuary, Issues of Refugees. And she worked with the company for 8 years. But what tended to happen, unless somebody could become core staff, and at any time, given time, at the most there were 4 of us, was that there was never enough work to sustain the freelance jokers, you know. And
so the challenge of professionalizing some of this work, which is again a challenge that we've had because we made that choice.
And so people would come and go is the thing.
People would come and go. Are you aware of any particular? Are you particularly proud of any particular pieces of work you did, perhaps with those communities where you had a strong sense of that something changed, something was achieved?
Yeah, there's many.
Give us an example.
Yeah, so, you know, a very big one that also changed the direction of my work that I've written about in my book was the invitation to do Out of the Silence by the United Native Nations, which was an Indigenous urban organization here in Vancouver.
And that was on sexual abuse. Am I right in saying that?
Correct. In 1992, and the reason for the project, of course, is when children would come out of residential school and they'd been abused, you know, from 6 years old to maybe 16 years old. How did they learn to parent? And so that translated itself into people's homes. Of course it did, as a result of colonization. And so communities were really struggling internally with violence issues. And, you know, and so United Native Nations wanted this peace, and they wanted an assurance from me. This is going to answer 2 questions maybe at the same time, that while we knew there'd be an abuser in the play, that person not be portrayed as a monster who needed to be locked up and have a key thrown away, but rather as someone who needed healing. Like, we would never condone the actions, but we would have compassion for the human. This was a very big challenge for me. I come out of my own challenging childhood. I was very invested in there being monsters in the world. But they were right. And a group of family violence survivors, everybody in the project, came together and made this very courageous play in '92. It toured all over BC and had support around it. And I still hear about it today, that it changed people's lives.
So why were they right, David? Why was that a more helpful way, a more appropriate way of going at a very, very difficult subject than the other way? Not necessarily to say monsters, but to where you cite yourself, who you side with. Is that not important in terms of getting an audience to empathize a certain way, to feel safe in a space, to speak out?
Well, I think it's very important to feel safe in a space, safe enough, as people were doing, to come up and replace the abuser in front of their community. Not to abuse better, but to try to break the cycles of abuse in legitimate ways. Because, you know, let's be clear, statistics being what they are, the last time I looked, 7 out of 10 women in the world experience violence from men at some time in their lives. Well, it's not the same guy going around and doing this. It is, you know, the abuser is in the room in every single audience we play to.
But I get that. But is it not a little bit too easy for me to come up and replace the abuser? Because I don't experience whatever pressures or historical or childhood or psychological factors. I can just come up and say, well, I don't do that.
Well, no. Well, if you do that, then because we talk about every intervention, I'm going to ask you how. How do you not just do that? You know, people don't just come up and do whatever they want and then leave the stage. They're held accountable for their actions.
But I was going to say to you, I just, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. And if there's no, what are you going to say to me?
If that happens, the other actor is going to go, really? Really? You're just not going to do that? I've heard you say that 100 times, Dad.
Okay.
And now we're in a scene. You know,
you choose not to present the.
I choose to honor whatever comes onto the stage.
No, I understand. I understand that.
There's something to learn from whatever comes onto the stage.
No, I don't disagree with that at all, David. But what I'm interested in is my own gut feeling would be that if we were interested in understanding the causes of these behaviors, we would need to put them in the play. We would need to make them concrete and visible. And,
yes, I absolutely agree with you.
Okay. Then it would be more difficult for me just to come up and say, I don't do that, because I would get whatever pressures are coming at me from various sides saying, go on, whatever, you know.
And so, whatever, you know. And so what you do is you put a piece on the stage, a play on the stage that has the complexity of life in it. And so, for instance, in Out of the Silence, there was this scene where the dad has gotten very mad at his son, and he's pounding. It's brutal. He's pounding on the son, and in that moment, there's a light change, and all the actors come around the dad and are screaming at him things that would have been screamed at him by the nuns and the priests in residential school. It's like a cops in the head moment, sort of. And you don't have to be Indigenous to understand this. Let's be clear, family violence exists across the board, you know, but something I learned in that piece is people don't go, I'm wrong, I'm wrong, I'm wrong, I'm a bad person. They don't do that. They go, I'm right. And sometimes they go, I promised myself I wouldn't do this. No, look at the way he's looking at me. Bam, and it happens like this.
And
And so
never,
if you want to put it on the stage, you put it on the, because you know why? Otherwise, you're dealing with the symptom. And you're not.
I'm fully, I agree with that. Just to probe just a little bit more on this one, there were never occasions on which survivors felt aggrieved at an apparent rebalancing of sympathy or understanding, when perhaps the first obvious port of call for our sympathy and understanding and solidarity would need to be with the people who have survived these horrific behaviors.
And don't misunderstand. It was very unusual for people to come up and replace the abuser.
Okay.
Right. But in that work, people could replace anybody if they understood the struggle of that character. That was the challenge. And I would suggest that in front of your community, where there are secrets that everybody knows but nobody wants to talk about, that to come up on stage and go, I understand the character of the abuser. And then to publicly go through some kind of a process, and these were heartbreaking sometimes, of trying to break the cycle that the audience member knows they're in their own home, in front of their community.
Yeah.
There was tremendous thanks for that.
Now I can see and imagine and have experienced similarly the power of those moments. I suppose you said they can replace anyone.
Yes.
So
whose struggle they understand.
Sorry?
Whose struggle they understand.
Whose struggle they understand. So that in itself is already a version, a slight diversion, to be honest, from the sort of purist form of TO, where Boal would say, and most of us would say, you replace the protagonist, and the protagonist is the person whose oppression we are pretty much focused on.
Yeah, because this was responding to the request from United Native Nations that, they liked what the Theatre of the Oppressed work was, but they didn't like what it did inside their community, which was polarize the community.
Because they were particularly interested in healing.
Correct.
I see. And that was a cultural thing, perhaps, particularly an approach to using rituals such as theater.
Yeah, and it's also a recognition that everything is interconnected. That we actually don't live in the mechanized world that Western science has taught us we live in. Okay. And so it really is a challenge to how we see the world.
And what about, again, things that have come up in a number of these conversations, different choices, different jokers around the world make about who can replace who? You have any rules about that, or it's up for grabs?
Well, I'm quite insistent that you understand the struggle that the character's engaged in. And those words are chosen carefully.
But how can you ascertain that when somebody shuts, stop, or sticks their hand up?
You can't, but you never can. Let's talk about magic for a second, because I think that's underlying this, right? I think that absolutely every intervention is magic, all of them. The idea that you can sit in a space, watch something unfold, yell stop, get it on the stage, replace a character in a play and try something different is magic. And so the question then becomes, what's acceptable magic? And what's unacceptable magic? And if you've created characters who all of them are struggling with these issues, and some of them, perhaps all of them, are out of that struggle with the issues, doing things that are contributing somehow to the problem, somehow. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that the person who's being beaten up is responsible for being beaten up. No. But in a model where you recognize that things are interconnected, then you have to recognize that the person who's like this and the person who's like this are in the same toxic soup together.
Yes. I mean, I can see that, I mean, of course, a challenge about forum theatre to begin with, an easy misreading of it is that it victim blames or survivor blames or whatever, that it's focused there. It seems to me, have gone quite a way in the opposite direction. And I suppose I'm interested in at what point you bring in this level of complexity, if you see what I mean. I'm kind of presuming you start from the obvious place, which is this person is oppressing this person, and then with an audience's journey, as it were, come gradually to understand the more complex equilibrium that you're speaking about.
Well, the complexities in the play.
Okay.
You know, you see it in the play. I come, I don't know if this answers your thing or not, but Boal was we know this, was a theater guy before he became Augusto Boal.
Yes.
And he didn't call his work, lecture of the oppressed. Mm-hmm. He called it theater of the oppressed. And the theater was really important to him. And I think sometimes people forget this.
No, I'm always banging on about how important the theatre is, and for my own belief with Cardboard Citizens is the stronger the theatre, the better the quality of the debate.
Yeah. And strong theatre then means that the characters on the stage understand character history and backgrounds and relationships.
Complex. But I suppose some might say we have limits to our reservoirs of sympathy and empathy, and we maybe wish to direct those first of all in particular directions and come later to, otherwise we maybe end up with a society where we believe everything is understandable. And
yeah, look, if you're dealing with a play on family violence, because that's where we're sitting right now, right? Yes, there is an emergency, and that is that people are getting beaten up, okay? And we have to create safety for that, however that happens in the forum, right?
Yeah. And
the audience isn't stupid, they see that. They don't have to be directed to do that. They're doing that. It really is a dialogue with the audience. But if you're going to go into an authentic dialogue with the audience, then you've got to be prepared also for them to come with things in an order you might not agree with solutions you don't agree with, and try to figure that out. Otherwise, you're not in a dialogue. You're in an educational moment.
No, I think there is a lot of TO which is shaped like that. And as you know, I think I'm for complexity. But I suppose there's an interesting question which we all face is where we place ourselves and whether we keep our anger well honed, which it needs to be at some level or other, to develop these interesting pieces.
Out of the Silence wasn't created because anybody thought that family violence was a good idea.
No, I'm not teaching it like that. Let me ask a question which was on my mind, and Kathleen McCreary is asking. In those situations, I know you're no longer doing that project, David, but what happens when the project is over? Who is there to help the long-term healing needed?
So in projects like that, and there have been many of them, I would hire a full-time support person who was connected to the project all the time. And when and if we were performing here in Vancouver, there'd be local support people in the audience. And if we were touring, because a lot of the projects toured, there would be a team of support people from the local community. Our support person, when we got into town, would meet with the local support people, prepare them for what was coming in the event, and they would then be in the community. You know,
how long would they be there, David? How long would they be available? Again, we did a similar thing quite early on in Cardboard Citizens history. We used to tour schools quite a lot, and we made a piece around sexual abuse, and we made similar insistences. We didn't have the resources to have our own person, but we would speak to schools. We'd say we wish to be assured that there is a named available person here, and that they will be around not just after the show, but they will be around for a week, whatever. Some schools did it, some schools didn't. You know?
We didn't perform in schools.
Right.
It was community work, and the support people would be introduced. There'd be their contact information would be on an insert in the program. They were available.
Okay.
Were they going and seeking people out later? No, I'm sure they weren't. But do I know that they were used? I do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's interesting because you never know what happens. We toured a piece called Meth that we were asked to do by the Stalo Nation on meth addiction. Mm-hmm. And one night we were in Gitsan territory, and it was like a 3-ring circus. People were lining up to get on the stage. 3 nights later, we're in a different community, same play, silence, dead silence, like nobody would do anything. I did everything I could think of. I tap danced across the stage, silence. And finally, I sat down on the stairs of our stage and I said, okay, look, I'm not here to try to drag you on the stage. What's the silence? And we had this conversation about shame. If I yell stop, I go up there, people are going to think I'm an addict. I don't want them to think I'm an addict. Well, the addiction organization has brought us in. You know, there's an issue in the community. And so we had this conversation, and I had to calm the cast down. They were really angry with the audience, you know, and all this stuff. Well, 3 days later, I got an email from the organizers. They had, after the thing, 100 referrals into the addiction program.
So that's a pleasing result. And that play that was toured, and the same company acted it over a number of occasions, and they were recruited from where?
They were ex-meth addicts, 3 of them.
So they were all people from lived experience. And,
always, 100% of the time in my work.
Okay. Yeah.
Everybody on the stage.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's another area which has come up again and again in these conversations, which is usually summarized with a version of preaching to the converted. So I don't need to unpack what that question is usually about to you, I'm sure, David. What are your feelings about that? The notion being that TO in a lot of places is already speaking to people who already agree with it.
First of all, let me say I don't think there's any such thing as the converted. I think that term is a weapon that's used to negate work. You know, Augusto used to say that all theater is political. You know, I remember this is a quote that I used to use from very early on. All theater is political because all the actions of men and women are political, and theater's one of them. And I think that's true. So whatever you put on the stage is political somehow. Yeah, because most often it's reinforcing the status quo.
That's an accepted notion, yeah.
I don't think there's any such thing as the converted. And I think that if you're making theater that is actually asking questions you don't have answers to, and that's really important to me. You know, like if you already know what the answers are, don't make forum theater and ask people to intervene. You know, give them a pamphlet.
I think we all accept that TO, which knows the answers to questions beforehand, is agitprop theatre and is not.
Yes,
that's pretty central. I suppose the thing that I'm coming to understand about. Sorry, David. By all means, complete your thought in a moment. That you took your theatre on, or it has taken you on a journey about using theatre for healing,
for dialogue.
for dialogue leading to healing, maybe. Whereas perhaps a lot of TO practitioners around the world, that they wouldn't necessarily name, they would name the dialogue bit, and you and I might agree or disagree about whether it is true dialogue or not, and it would vary in case to case, but not all would necessarily be concerned with healing. And I'm beginning to understand that that's been, perhaps since that formative experience with those Indigenous people all that time ago, more and more the focus of your work.
Well, I want to try to explain something about behavior and structure. That, going back to Freire writes eloquently in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed that sometimes oppressed communities fight revolutions, and sometimes they win, often to become the very oppressors they were fighting against. And we see this over and over again throughout history. Like, why does that happen? Well, I think that nature teaches us one of the reasons it happens. And that is that it is patterns of behavior that create structure, not the other way around. And so, don't get me wrong, I think structural change is really important. And I know people doing really good work on structural change, okay? For me, the power of the theater is human behavior. And so, for me, in a healthy activist ecology, there are many different ways of working. And they support each other.
Of course.
Right? And so for me, the work is, I'm getting fragmented. Structural change is really important. But if all we do is work to change the structures and neglect the patterns of behavior that created and sustained those structures, we're doomed to recreate the same structures all over again.
Yeah.
And so for me, the work is about behavior, and it supports the structural change, because the theater, I don't think, can do everything.
I suppose this is a choice, and very eloquently, clearly put. I understand that. I suppose some TO practitioners would say that without changing the structure, any behavioral change is tinkering, and it just suggests that it's how we behave which is the problem. The other argument would be it's how we are taught to behave, how we are led to behave, and the laws which make us behave in certain ways and structures which causes the oppression.
For me, people can work the way they want to work.
Yes. And right? I'm just making a separation.
But, just yesterday, I was listening to Cindy Blackstock, who is a very respected, again, Indigenous lawyer here. And she said something. She said, governments don't change. Governments respond to change. And, I think if we look at historically that's true.
So, I mean, this brings me to, sorry, I'm pushing on because we have limited time and I'm trying to put the questions in, but a really important thing I wanted to ask you about, which I think we've logically arrived at, is you, having started making work which was fundamentally named as being theatre of the oppressed, at a certain point you decided to name something else, create something else, theatre for living, which deliberately has slightly separated you from TO. Tell us about that decision and what are the distinctions?
Yeah, well, I think we've been in some way talking about the distinction.
Well, that's right. That's what I was wondering. Yeah.
And what happened was, and I want to say, Augusto and I loved each other. He changed my life, and we were very dear friends. And the communication between us, first in letters and then in email, was profound. And I miss him.
Yeah, we all do.
And I think that everything evolves. Every living thing evolves. And as my work changed, and it changed not just out of the silence, but it changed in reaction to working with communities and what they wanted, the texture of what they wanted, and my own lifelong interest in physics, which we don't need to talk about. But no, I need to say this, because we're living in very difficult but also remarkable times where Western science has come around full circle and is meeting once again Indigenous knowledge. And the area that started happening the most through was physics, in particular quantum physics. And it's coming at this thing from very different places, but lo and behold, that idea that the fish and the trees and the water and the rocks and the people are all brothers and sisters somehow is in fact true, even though Western science tried to negate it.
I seem to remember that the introduction to your book is written by Fritjof Capra, who is, I guess, a physicist.
Yes, and so at some point, I had to recognize that the work I was doing was breaking a lot of the rules of the Theatre of the Oppressed. And out of respect to Augusto, I had to find a different label, because it wasn't TO anymore.
But is it not fair to say, I mean, it's an interesting question about the rules, because it's my profound belief that there are far less rules than sometimes people say there are. And I think many of the people I've spoken to in this series break rules, if there are rules. But is it not fair to say that a pretty substantial portion of Theatre for Living is still basically TO?
It has emerged really strongly out of TO, but it's also embraced this idea. And so if you come into a workshop, what you'll see is, and people who come into training start to understand this, every game, every exercise, and some of them haven't come from Augusto, they've come out of me, have changed at a cellular level. And so, because they're all of them affected by this idea, that concept of mechanization is a false idea, and that everything in fact is interconnected, that all of life is a series of feedback loops.
But the games are still fairly similar, but what, if I understand you correctly, the understanding of them, or the reading of them, or the unpacking of them is colored by your interest in physics and the way you've gone with this sort of healing. Is that
yes,
fair?
And sometimes the way they're facilitated.
Right.
And of course, the way forum is done, the way plays are structured, and the way forum is done, the way Rainbow of Desire is done. Cops in the Head has been, changed and adapted. It's now kind of upside down to how I first learned to do it. The audience is much more in control of it. When we do image theater, I'm much more interested in the workshop groups' perceptions of the image, working with the psyche that's in the room, as opposed to working on the image to serve the image maker, for instance. And I prepare people for that.
Yes, I'm not sure that I would have thought that is simply a way of playing with image theater. I mean, I don't think image theater, is there any suggestion anywhere that it necessarily is to serve the image maker?
When I was introduced to image theater, I would say yes. Yes.
Okay. I think I read it quite differently. I mean, I think I always take Augusto's useful phrase, the word spoken is never the word heard, or the image seen is never the image made, or whatever, because I think it's all about our projection. But look, we have limited time left. I'm going to ask one more question, which I think we may have covered, but it's, where do you see your work being most useful now? I know you no longer the hard slog of running Theatre for Living, you decided to put aside, but you are still teaching in many places, teaching TFL, Theatre for Living. There's a danger when I say TFL here, people think it's Transport for London. So I guess you're not teaching Transport for London.
You know, if I can say, when the name bubbled up one day when I was doing Tai Chi, if you want to know the truth, in the middle of a Tai Chi exercise. And I didn't ever think that people would start calling it theater for the living.
For the living.
Of the oppressed. And I always have to say to people, no, it's not theater for the living as opposed to theater for the dead. It's theater for living.
Yeah. These titles are very important, and you've got to get them right early on. I'm very proud that somebody suggested Cardboard Citizens early on, and I still like the title. It still says things I like to hear. But yes, so how is your work being used now, and where do you see it most useful? And I suppose people are also interested in the COVID moment. Don't know how much useful there is or isn't to say about that, particularly in relation to the Indigenous communities.
Well, for many, many years now, I've only done stuff that I'm invited to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so invitations continue, although right now, of course, everything is dried up. There's a request to come to Switzerland right now in January, and I'm questioning whether or not that's going to be possible.
Yeah.
But you know, I was in Ethiopia last year helping develop curriculum for Haramaya University. That led actually to a deepening of the women's studies program at Haramaya. I'm still visiting faculty of UNESCO's Peace Studies program. That kind of stuff continues. The trainings will continue.
You don't miss any part of. I mean, you're sort of flying doctor these days. You don't miss any part of having the base of the company. You do.
Yes, I do. You know, here's the thing. I don't miss the pressure of raising money every day of my life and being responsible for people's salaries. I was getting bitter. It was burning me out. 38 years of it. But I do miss the camaraderie of the company. And, you know, there are big things going on in the world. There are big projects to do. And I have regrets about giving up my ability to do that. There is lots to do. But the big focus for me, I think, continues to be real dialogue. But for instance, climate change hasn't gone away. You know, it's still underlying everything. And, you know, lately, this last while, and I think part of this is COVID has done this. It's created an environment where we are being forced to realize that we are all interconnected.
I mean, I'm getting some flack from the outside world about not asking a particular question, so I'm going to ask it. But I think we have arrived at it. This series of talks, conversations was called "What Now," and I suppose people are interested to know what now. And we've talked a bit about your personal what now, but you and I are also both involved in the wider Theatre of the Oppressed international community. And I suppose people are interested in your thoughts about what now for that community. One thing you're saying is climate change is a thing that we need to.
Yeah, I want to also applaud, because I'm thinking of kind of trying to follow this path a little bit. The work that Mark Weinblatt is doing in Washington State, because starting many years ago, he started doing anti-racism work for white people. And he got in a lot of trouble for doing that when he started doing it, because he was doing theater of the oppressor. But there are, in every community, when we talk about healing, and my approach to it is perhaps different, but in the same way that non-Indigenous Canadians have to come to terms, and it can be traumatic to come to terms with the truth of Canadian history, right? I have a dear friend who's an immigrant from Hong Kong, and getting to know me was a bad thing for her. because she came to a different country than what the country actually is. And I started making her aware of the truth of Canadian history. And this created a trauma for her. And I think we have to understand that and not just say, well, too bad. Because if she's going to go on a journey of really being
back in Hong Kong now, is she?
No, she's here. She's here.
Because of course they're facing a terrible struggle.
There's all that going on. But so what I'm saying is, the white community also has a journey to go on.
Okay.
It's like, you know, the Black Lives Matter issues haven't just suddenly appeared. They've been there for a very, very, very long time. But it's like the curtain's been drawn all of a sudden. And so there is work to do that isn't, in the same way that reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous in Canada isn't the Indigenous people's job to do. It's our job to do. It's the same with the Black Lives Matter. The white community has work to do, and it's internal work. And some of it is really challenging, right? And I think it's important not to just go, well, you know, you're just the oppressor. It's important to be able to own things. And there's a process that has to happen in there. And I think, so part of my work is trying to step into that and figure out ways to do that in ways that open the thing up for people that actually create behavioral change. Because, you know, let me just say this, you can't legislate respect. You can try, but you can't.
No, I mean, obviously, Cardboard Citizens, like in every other company, we're dealing a lot and doing our best to look at the part we can play in Black Lives Matter. And one of the things I think you're saying there is that guilt and shame are not necessarily going to be the best motivators of change. That's sort of that if we're looking at ourselves, we have to find an enthusiasm for change and what can we do, and look at ourselves and see what we can do. Several of these questions, by the way, are from Mir Mubashir, who I thought I should say because I suspect he's somebody known to you. Several of his questions were statements, which is why, Mir, I didn't ask them, because they were perfectly good statements, but David was saying some of them anyway.
I'm waving at you, Mir.
You're being waved at. David, I'm going to ask one quick more question, the last one, and then leave you a minute to round off. This is from Salil Muzonde, Roof Theatre, in simple terms, the roof play. I've heard that the whole stage drama is staged in many places on the roof. However, my philosophy in this regard is exactly about development drama. In the context of Bangladesh, development plays are generally played in the rural area. From that point on, I thought roof theatre would be urban-centric, would be played. Usually most of our country buildings have enough space on top. I'm not sure I fully understand. Are you familiar with roof theatre, David? This is more like, I started reading it out thinking it was a question, but I think it's more like useful information, which you and I can both read afterwards and get our heads around a roof theatre. So sorry if I haven't understood that, Salil. David, last minute or two of our conversation, what have we not covered? What would you like to say?
You know, I think that humanity is actually at a precipice on many levels. Some people think I'm flaky, right? But let me say this, that if you recognize that the earth is a living organism and it's in trauma, wind patterns are changing, ocean currents are changing, the poles are melting, and we are just another, ironically, you know, inconsequential but very consequential living organism on this larger living organism. Why wouldn't we also be in trauma in ways that we actually don't understand? And so I think there is today a lot of work to do about that is building bridges, not more walls, you know, because we're witnessing polarization happen all over the world right now. And I believe that some of that, in ways we don't understand, not all of it, has to do with what's happening climate-wise.
Mm.
And we have huge challenges coming. And so I think the work is to build bridges in between communities.
Well, very inspiring, David, and it's been really great to talk to you. Though I know you are Theatre for Living or Transport for London now, I still regard you as a really important member of our great Theatre of the Oppressed family, and one of the great jokers of the world I've had the pleasure of watching at work. So I know that even though you've hung up your company boots, you will play that part in building these bridges across these precipices, which is so important now.
Can I say, I've always thought that Theatre for Living is part of the Theatre of the Oppressed community.
Good. Me too. So thank you so much, David. And it's been a delight talking to you. And I wish you all luck with next projects, future projects, and take care and be strong.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. Thank you for this.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah.